Whether God exists is one of the most basic and important questions any person can consider. Opinions about God abound, but answering the question, does God exist, demands more than a few seconds of attention and involves a wide range of ideas and evidence. Ultimately, what we see in human experience, science, logic, and history leads to a confident answer. God is not an object of human experience, and hence his existence is not immediately evident to man and must be demonstrated. Thus arises the problem of God's existence, a problem that lies at the summit of philosophical endeavor and whose solution has direct bearing on the meaning and purpose of human life. If God does not exist, then man becomes a law to himself and the norm of his own acts. But if God exists, man must acknowledge his essential dependence on a creator, who is also his conservator, legislator, and judge, to whom he is responsible for all his acts and operations. This is the striking disjunction that somehow or other confronts every individual with a cogency that admits no delay or alternative. Often, this question is posed as, can you prove God exists? The problem is that while truth itself is absolute, there are virtually zero instances of absolute proof outside of pure logic and mathematics. For that reason, courtrooms don't require absolute proof to reach a verdict. Rather, they seek to dispel reasonable doubt and consider what's most probable. Demanding proof of God that no one could ever reject is unreasonable. Neither evidence nor people function that way in the real world. Encountering facts and accepting them are profoundly different. Airtight sound arguments will remain unconvincing to those determined to disbelieve. For the resolute skeptic, it's not proof, even if it would convince almost anyone else. A person's intent is more influential than any evidence encountered. Philosophers are acutely aware of the importance of this problem and attempt to offer a solution in line with their own systems. Their attitudes toward God's existence may be reduced to three. Theists affirm it, atheists deny it, and agnostics question it. Along with these three main positions, there are systems of philosophy that admit the existence of God, but deny some of the basic characteristics of the Supreme Being, such as His personal nature, transcendence, and providence. There are also those who refuse to admit the problematic nature of the issue and claim that man has a quasi-intuitive knowledge of God or a direct experience of His presence. Various philosophical errors regarding the existence of God, alternative approaches to the existence of God that have been advanced by philosophers, and philosophical proofs for God's existence. Before we come to a conclusion about whether God exists or not, let's first go look into the arguments of existence and non-existence views of God. Non-theistic view. Atheistic view. The word atheism is polysemous. It has multiple related meanings. In the psychological sense of the word, atheism is a psychological state, specifically the state of being an atheist, where an atheist is defined as someone who is not a theist, and a theist is defined as someone who believes that God exists or that there are gods. This generates the following definition. Atheism is a psychological state of lacking the belief that God exists. In philosophy, however, and more specifically, in the philosophy of religion, the term atheism is standardly used to refer to the proposition that God does not exist, or more broadly, to the proposition that there are no gods. Thus, to be an atheist on this definition, it does not suffice to suspend judgment on whether there is a God, even though that implies a lack of theistic belief. Instead, one must deny that God exists. This metaphysical sense of the word is preferred over other senses, including the psychological sense, not just by theistic philosophers, but by many, though not all, atheists in philosophy as well. For example, Robin Lee Poidevin writes, "An atheist is one who denies the existence of a personal, transcendent creator of the universe, rather than one who simply lives his life without reference to such a being." J.L. Schellenberg says that in philosophy, the atheist is not just someone who does not accept theism, but more strongly, someone who opposes it. In other words, it is the denial of theism, the claim that there is no God. This view was famously proposed by the philosopher Antony Flew and arguably played a role in his 1972 defense of an alleged presumption of atheism. The editors of the Oxford Handbook of Atheism, Bullivant and Roos, also favor this definition, and one of them, Stephen Bullivant, defends it on grounds of scholarly utility. His argument is that this definition can best serve as an umbrella term for a wide variety of positions that have been identified with atheism. Scholars can then use adjectives like strong and weak or positive and negative to develop a taxonomy that differentiates various specific atheisms. Unfortunately, this argument overlooks the fact that if atheism is defined as a psychological state, then no proposition can count as a form of atheism because a proposition is not a psychological state. This undermines Bullivant's argument in defense of Flew's definition, for it implies that what he calls strong atheism, the proposition or belief in the sense of something believed that there is no God, is not really a variety of atheism at all. In short, his proposed umbrella term leaves so-called strong atheism or what someone called positive atheism out in the rain. Although Flew's definition of atheism fails as an umbrella term, it is certainly a legitimate definition in the sense that it reports how a significant number of people use the term. Again, the term atheism has more than one legitimate meaning, and nothing said in this entry should be interpreted as an attempt to prescribe how people label themselves or what meanings they attach to those labels. The issue for philosophy, and thus for this entry, is which definition is the most useful for scholarly or more narrowly philosophical purposes. In other contexts, of course, the issue of how best to define atheism or atheist may look very different. For example, in some contexts, the crucial question may be which definition of atheist, as opposed to atheism, is the most useful political, especially in light of the bigotry that those who identify as atheists face. The fact that there is strength in numbers may recommend a very inclusive definition of atheist that brings anyone who is not a theist into the fold. Having said that, one would think that it would further no good cause, political or otherwise, to attack fellow non-theists who do not identify as atheists, simply because they choose to use the term atheist in some other, equally legitimate sense. If, as has been argued here, atheism is both usually and best understood in philosophy as the metaphysical claim that God does not exist, then what, one might wonder, should philosophers do with the popular term new atheism? Philosophers write articles on and have devoted general issues, French and Westin 2013, to the new atheism, but there is nothing close to a consensus on how that term should be defined. Fortunately, there is no real need for one, because the term new atheism does not pick out some distinctive philosophical position or phenomenon. Instead, it is a popular label for a movement prominently represented by four authors: Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, whose work is uniformly critical of religion, but beyond that appears to be unified only by timing and popularity. Further, one might question what is new about the new atheism. The specific criticisms of religion and of arguments used to defend religion are not new. For example, an arguably more sophisticated and convincing version of Dawkins' central atheistic argument can be found in Hume's Dialogues, Wielenberg 2009. Also, while Dennett 2006 makes a passionate call for the scientific study of religion as a natural phenomenon. Such study existed long before this call. Indeed, even the cognitive science of religion was well established by the 1990s, and the anthropology of religion can be traced back at least to the 19th century. Shifting from content to style, many are surprised by the militancy of some new atheists, but there were plenty of aggressive atheists who were quite disrespectful to religion long before Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchens. Dennett is not especially militant. Finally, the stereotype that new atheism is religious or quasi-religious or ideological in some unprecedented way is clearly a false one, and one that new atheists reject. Agnostic view. Agnostic means one who lacks knowledge of God. Agnostic is one who says we cannot know that God even exists. Agnostics are followers of pragmatism. Their belief that something has to be scientifically verifiable, and they leave him and out of the discussion. Agnosticism maintains that the nature and attributes of God are beyond the grasp of man's finite and limited mind. Agnostics generally claim either that it is not possible to have absolute and certain knowledge of the existence or non-existence of God or gods, or that, while individual certainty may be possible, they personally have no knowledge. In both cases, this involves some form of skepticism. The earliest professed agnostic was Protagoras, although the term itself from the Greek agnosis, meaning without knowledge, was not coined in English until the 1880s by T.H. Huxley. Types of agnosticism. Strong agnosticism. This is the view also called hard, closed, strict, absolute, or epistemological agnosticism. That the question of the existence or non-existence of God or gods is unknowable by reason of our natural inability to verify any experience with anything but another subjective experience. Pragmatic agnosticism. This is the view that there is no proof of either the existence or non-existence of God or gods. Mild agnosticism. This is the view also called weak, soft, open, empirical, or temporal agnosticism, that the existence or non-existence of God or gods is currently unknown, but is not necessarily unknowable. Therefore, one will withhold judgment until more evidence becomes available. Agnostic atheism. This is the view of those who claim not to know of the existence or non-existence of God or gods, but do not believe in them. Support for agnosticism. Some of the most important agnostic philosophers are Protagoras, T.H. Huxley, Robert Ingersoll, and Bertrand Russell. But many more public figures have been self-confessed agnostics, including Charles Darwin, Milton Friedman, Carl Sagan, and Mark Twain. The Greek sophist Protagoras was probably the earliest agnostic. He professed that the existence of gods was unknowable in the 5th century BC. Huxley was responsible for creating the terms agnostic and agnosticism to sum up his own position on metaphysics. His agnosticism was a response to the clerical intolerance of the 1860s as it tried to suppress scientific discoveries which appeared to clash with scripture. Ingersoll, known as the Great Agnostic, was an influential American politician in the late 19th century and a strong supporter of free thought. The philosophical viewpoint that holds that beliefs should be formed on the basis of science and logic and not be influenced by emotion, authority, tradition, or dogma. He popularized and justified the agnostic position, which is summed up in his 1986 lecture, Why I'm an Agnostic. Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian and I'm an Atheist or an Agnostic are considered classic statements of agnosticism. He was careful to distinguish between his atheism as regards certain types of God concepts and his agnosticism as regards some other types of superhuman intelligence. Though he generally considered himself an agnostic in a purely philosophical context, he said that the label atheist conveyed a more accurate understanding of his views in a popular context.